Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for September 23rd, 2025. Well, I'm sure by now you've heard that the United Nations General Assembly is conducting hearings on what can be done to stop the genocide against the Palestinian population of Gaza. There are moves for taking the issue out of the Security Council and acting under the UN General Assembly to use the Uniting for Peace resolution as a way of bringing the UN on the side of the Palestinian people. And there are a number of nations which have endorsed the idea of an independent Palestinian state. However, most stop short of what's necessary, which is how do you assure that a new state could survive under circumstances where the people have been under intense bombardment, mass murder, the cities have been destroyed, the infrastructure destroyed. How can this succeed? Would this just be another trap to justify continued Israeli colonialism? Now, there's a second aspect of this, which is as bad as President Trump's glowing tribute to King Charles and the British Empire was this last weekend, it's matched by his foolish decision to bring in Tony Blair to clean up after the genocide in Gaza. Now, Blair met with Trump at the White House on August 27th, and according to the Times of Israel, Trump authorized Blair to organize regional and international stakeholders to govern Gaza. Now, this was not an open endorsement of Netanyahu's plan for ethnic cleansing, but it includes a provision to provide a token sum to every Gazan who leaves voluntarily. Of course, voluntarily meaning to avoid getting killed. And then a vague promise of a right to return at some future point. Now, part of the plan includes bringing in leading Muslim figures to function as a cover for purging the region of the Palestinian population. And what it would establish is a Gaza real estate plan along the lines of the so-called Gaza Riviera project discussed by Trump and Kushner and others. And secondly, to connect with rail and ports, a transportation corridor to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. So a media contact who lives in the area said that the reason they will allow a certain number of Palestinians to remain is to have low workers who can work in the low-wage jobs at the hotels and others, but not a real chance for a future. So the question then comes up, what would be the basis for this plan to achieve statehood for Palestine? And this plan has no pathway to establish a Palestinian state. So the question then is, why bring in Tony Blair? Well, this gives international credibility to the extension of colonial rule at a time when the world has acknowledged Netanyahu's policy is that of genocide, and there's increased pressure on the UN General Assembly to intervene and recognize a Palestinian state. But how does Blair bring in credibility? Well, the other aspect of this is that Blair's role is as a supposed independent broker, which he's not. He's a certain face of the British Imperial tradition. But his role is to counter Arab participation in the emergence of a post-colonial system. And what we're seeing is an alliance emerging in the Middle East between the sovereign Arab states and the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so on. In other words, a number of the Arab countries are concluding that their future security depends on a new security and development architecture. And the other aspect of the Blair policy is to prevent a serious development plan from being implemented. For example, the LaRouche Oasis plan that by putting this counter plan of connectivity with India, with British puppets, that this would solve the problem of the Arab demand for economic development. But of course it doesn't. It's just a continuation of colonialism with a new face. So the question is, who is Blair? And many of the younger people watching our daily updates may not know much about him. But Blair was presented as a new, fresh figure when he came into office in 2007. 1997. As someone who represented a third way between traditional labor socialism and Tory conservatism. But what was the third way? Well, it was an imperial policy with a democratic face. And Blair made this clear with his campaigning for a post-Westphalian order. Now, what this means is a rejection of the principles of the Peace of Westphalia adopted in 1648, which put an end to the 30 Years' War, but actually an end to 150 years of religious warfare in Europe. And what it said is that the nations must recognize the right to sovereignty of other nations, non-interference in internal affairs, and a policy toward other nations, which is the representative of the policy you'd like toward yourself. And this conception from the Peace of Westphalia guaranteed a relative peace for several hundred years. And I would say the central concept is this idea of non-interference in the affairs of other nations. Now, in 1999, as Blair was campaigning against this idea, he gave a speech at the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, in which he said, "The world has changed. We can no longer accept the principles of the Peace of Westphalia." And instead, over time, he put forward the idea of the responsibility to protect. In other words, that powerful nations had a right to intervene to protect other nations from authoritarian governments. Now, this is nothing but an excuse for regime change, and that's exactly what it was, with the people like Samantha Power, Susan Rice, the so-called liberal side of this, and then Victoria Nuland, and the Kagan crowd of neoconservatives, who essentially say no nation has a right to do anything that goes against the order controlled by the City of London and Wall Street. So that's what the post-Westphalian order was all about. And if you look at Blair's record, you find that he also was very much involved in working with Islamic fundamentalist networks to destabilize nations throughout not just the region, but the world. Now, he worked with Clinton in the Balkans War, which led to 1999 massive bombing by NATO during the breakup of Yugoslavia. He worked with Bush on Iraq, getting the U.S. justified to go into Iraq by arguing that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which turns out, of course, to be a complete lie. But he gave Bush the information, the so-called intelligence from MI6, which Colin Powell presented to the UN Security Council to justify the invasion of Iraq. Now, the responsibility to protect, the so-called R2P, is nothing but a regime change doctrine, that the sovereign state of another country has no business if it goes against the interests of the unipolar order. And this is what Tony Blinken, who is a Blairite in many ways, called the rules-based order. The so-called rules that protect the interests of the imperial forces and subordinate nations to that unipolar order. And in fact, assume that any nation that's fighting for the interests of its own people, based on its claims to economic sovereignty, that represents a threat to the system and must be suppressed. Now, why should the United States endorse such a plan, especially under a president who says he's committed to the principle of national sovereignty? Well, I'm appending in the link in the description section of an article on the two doctrines, the Blair Doctrine and the LaRouche Doctrine. And it's called, there are two doctrines on the table. The Blair Doctrine essentially gives the imperial powers the right to intervene to protect their system, whereas the LaRouche Doctrine is based on the concept that sovereign nations have a right to act in the interests of their population, but seeking policies that are mutually beneficial with the neighbors. Again, the Peace of Westphalia. And this was implicit in LaRouche's Oasis Plan as a solution to the situation facing Israel and the Palestinians today. So it's essentially LaRouche's American system or Blair's British system. And President Trump must choose. His softness recently on the seeming embrace of the British system is a threat not only to the countries that are targeted by that system, but a threat to the United States as well. So I would urge him to read the document, the two doctrines on the table, and choose